China's 12-point plan for peace. Watch this space. China's position on the political statement of the Ukraine crisis, respecting the sovereignty of all countries. Universally recognized international law, including the purposes and principles of the UN Charter, must be strictly observed. The sovereignty, independence, and territorial integrity of all countries must be effectively upheld. All countries, big or small, strong or weak, rich or poor, are equal members of the international community. All parties should jointly uphold the basic norms governing international relations and defend international fairness and justice. Equal and uniform application of international law should be promoted, while double standards must be rejected. Point 2. Abandoning the Cold War mentality. The security of a country should not be pursued at the expense of others. The security of a region should not be achieved by strengthening or expanding military blocs. The legitimate security interests and concerns of all countries must be taken seriously and addressed properly. There's no simple solution to a complex issue. All parties should, following the vision of common, comprehensive, cooperative, and sustainable security, and bearing in mind the long-term peace and stability of the world, help forge a balanced, effective, and sustainable European security architecture. All parties should oppose the pursuit of one's own security at the cost of other security, prevent bloc confrontation, and work together for peace and stability on the Eurasian continent. I was surprised by the usage of the term European here. Ceasing hostilities. Conflict and war benefit no one. All parties must stay rational.
The whole notion of logic.
And excuse restraint. Avoid fanning the flames and aggravating tensions, and prevent the crisis from deteriorating further or even spiraling out of control. All parties should support Russia and Ukraine in working in the same direction, and resume direct dialogue as quickly as possible, so as to gradually de-escalate the situation and ultimately reach a comprehensive ceasefire. Resuming peace talks. Dialogue and negotiation are the only viable solution to the Ukraine crisis. All efforts conducive to the peaceful settlement of the crisis must be encouraged and supported. The international community should stay committed to the right approach of promoting talks for peace. Help parties to the conflict open the door to a political settlement as soon as possible, and create conditions and platforms for the resumption of negotiation. China will continue to play a constructive role in this regard. Resolving the humanitarian crisis. All measures conducive to easing the humanitarian crisis must be encouraged and supported. Humanitarian operations should follow the principles of neutrality and impartiality, and humanitarian issues should not be politicized. The safety of civilians must be effectively protected, and the humanitarian corridors should be set up for the evacuation of civilians from conflict zones. Efforts are needed to increase humanitarian assistance to relevant areas, improve humanitarian conditions, and provide rapid, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access, with a view to preventing a humanitarian crisis on a large scale. The UN should be supported in playing a coordinating role in channeling humanitarian aid to conflict zones, protecting civilians and prisoners of war. Parties to the conflict should strictly abide by international human law or humanitarian law, avoiding attacking civilians or civilian facilities, protect women, children, and other victims of the conflict, and respect the basic rights of POWs. China supports the exchange of POWs between Russia and Ukraine, and calls on all parties to create more favorable conditions for this purpose. Keeping nuclear power plants safe. China opposes armed attacks against nuclear power plants or other peaceful nuclear facilities, and calls on all parties to comply with international law, including the Convention on Nuclear Safety, and resolutely avoid man-made nuclear accidents. China supports the International Atomic Energy Agency in playing a constructive role in promoting the safety and security of peaceful nuclear facilities. Reducing strategic risks. Nuclear weapons must not be used, and nuclear wars must not be fought. The threat or use of nuclear weapons should be opposed. Nuclear proliferation must be prevented and nuclear crises avoided. China opposes the research, development, and use of chemical and biological weapons by any country under any circumstances, facilitating grain exports. All parties need to implement the Black Sea Grain Initiative signed by Russia, Turkey, Ukraine, and the UN fully and effectively in a balanced manner, and support the UN in playing an important role in this regard. The Cooperation Initiative on Global Food Security proposed by China provides a feasible solution to the global food crisis. Stopping unilateral sanctions. Unilateral sanctions and maximum pressure cannot solve the issue. They only create new problems. China opposes unilateral sanctions unauthorized by the UN Security Council. Relevant countries should stop abusing unilateral sanctions and long-arm jurisdiction against other countries so as to do their share in de-escalating the Ukraine crisis and create conditions for developing countries to grow their economies and better their lives of their people. Keeping industrial and supply chains stable. All parties should earnestly maintain the existing world economic system and oppose using the world economy as a tool or a weapon for political purposes. Joint efforts are needed to mitigate the spillovers of the crisis and prevent it from disrupting international cooperation in energy, finance, food, trade, and transportation, and undermining the global economic recovery. And finally, 12, promoting post-conflict reconstruction. The international community needs to take measures to support post-conflict reconstruction in conflict zones. China stands ready to provide assistance and play a constructive role in this endeavor. And from Dev Discourse, Russia welcomes China peace plan, says it's open to talks. Russia welcomed on Friday Chinese proposals to resolve the conflict in Ukraine and said it was open to achieving the goals of what it calls its special military operation through political and diplomatic means. China's called for a comprehensive ceasefire as part of a 12-point plan for dealing with the war, which began a year ago when Russia sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. Russia welcomed on Friday Chinese proposals to resolve the conflict in Ukraine and said it was open to achieving the goals of what it calls its special military operation through political and diplomatic means. China's called for a comprehensive ceasefire as part of a 12-point plan for dealing with the war, which began a year ago when Russia sent tens of thousands of troops into Ukraine. We appreciate the sincere desire of our Chinese friends to contribute to resolving the conflict in Ukraine by peaceful means. We share the views of Beijing, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova said in a statement. With regard to the Ukraine crisis, Russia is open to achieving the goals of the special military operation by political and diplomatic means, Zakharova said. However, this would also mean recognizing new territorial realities in Ukraine, Zakharova said, referring to Russia's unilateral annexation of 4 Ukrainian regions, Donetsk, Luhansk, Kherson, and Zaporozhye, as well as of Crimea. Ukraine has rejected the Chinese proposal unless it resolves or it involves Russia withdrawing its troops to its 1991 borders when the Soviet Union was dissolved. Although Kiev has also said it's open to parts of the plan, Kiev's Western allies have also reacted coolly to the Chinese proposals, with NATO saying Beijing did not have much credibility as a mediator in view of its close ties with Russia. And a clip from CNA. China calls for Russia-Ukraine ceasefire, peace talks, and 12-point policy paper.
China is urging Russia and Ukraine to resume peace talks. Beijing is pushing for negotiations, saying that is the only viable way to resolve conflict and reach a comprehensive ceasefire. The proposed negotiation is a major focus of the 12-point policy paper China released today.
我们一贯主张，一切有利于和平解决危机的努力都应当得到鼓励和支持。中方愿在关于政治解决乌克兰危机的中国立场文件基础上，继续同国际社会一道，为政治解决乌克兰危机发挥建设性作用。
Other key points: Beijing's rejection of unilateral sanctions not authorized by the UN Security Council. It's also made clear its strong opposition to the use of nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons by any country under any circumstances. China also calls for humanitarian corridors for evacuating civilians and proposes steps to ensure the export of grain from Ukraine. Disruptions in the past year have caused a spike in global food prices. And for more, we're joined by Lo Min live for us from Shanghai. Min, there has been skepticism, but can Beijing do much to bring warring parties together to agree on any kind of ceasefire?
Well, those looking for something new from Beijing are likely to be disappointed with this policy paper because it's mainly a reiteration of China's principles and is lacking on those specific details that would have made it actionable. And this conflict, it looks like it's headed into a deadlock both in the battlefield and also on the diplomatic front, because all the stakeholders have such competing sets of demands that seem so irreconcilable. The West wants China to condemn Russia, to stop buying up Russian oil and coal, and to join them in the sanctions against Moscow. But all these are things that China has resolutely refused to do. In fact, China is calling for the exact opposite, calling for the end of these unilateral sanctions, saying that they are a form of long-arm jurisdiction that interferes in the developmental rights of all nations. But this demand from China is likely to fall on deaf ears in the West. It's almost unthinkable that the US and its allies would even consider lifting sanctions on Moscow. In fact, they're looking to add more. And the Ukrainians, on the other hand, they have their own demands for the Russian troops to pull out from their territory, while the Russians will likely want some form of NATO guarantee on the non-expansion of NATO. So all of these clashing demands, it just looks like there is no easy way out.
Oh, thank you for that. Lo Min reporting live just there from Shanghai. Oh, China is urging
And from South China Morning, this is China releases 12-point position paper on 1-year anniversary of Russian invasion of Ukraine.
"中方在乌克兰问题上的立场是一贯的、明确的。我们始终主张各国主权、领土完整都应该得到尊重，联合国宪章宗旨和原则都应该得到遵守。国际社会要为劝和促谈做出共同努力。乌克兰危机已持续1年，残酷的事实充分证明，输送武器不会带来和平。拱火浇油只会加剧各方矛盾，延长冲突只会让普通民众付出更大代价。
And from Makad TV, NATO Secretary General with Prime Minister of Estonia, Kaja Kallas, and President Ursula von, this is the European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen.
Prime Minister Kaja Kallas, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Dear journalists, it is my great pleasure to see so many of you here today, as it is our Independence Day. Dear Jens, dear Ursula, I'm so glad that you accepted my invitation to join us here on our Independence Day when we celebrate our 105th anniversary of Estonia. This means a lot to me, and it also means a lot to Estonian people, so thank you for being here. Let me start by sharing a thought by De-escalation. The secret to happiness is freedom, again. For Estonians, the 24th of February has always been about celebrating freedom. We know that freedom comes at a price. You need to fight for it. Allied presence here in Estonia contributes every day to the security of our country and the alliance as a whole. But Estonia takes its own part of the burden increasingly seriously. We have been significantly boosting our defense spending. It's nearly 3% now. The will of this, I propose that EU member states jointly procure ammunition for Ukraine. During the pandemic, we were able to react quickly to jointly procure vaccines. Let us act quickly now and send more ammunition to Ukraine. We must keep in mind that the threat Russia poses is a long-term one. In addition to the conventional war, they are also waging a hybrid war to create chaos and divide us. All European countries need to invest more in their own defense and resilience. We cannot be afraid of Russian terror tactics. If we fall for Russia's threats, we will wake up in a much more dangerous world. Ukraine and Russia's other neighbors are not afraid. So why should those countries who are further from Ukraine be afraid? The way this war against Ukraine ends will define peace for generations to come. For any peace to last, there needs to be accountability. Russian crimes against Ukraine and its people must not go unpunished, and no Russian leader can be immune from responsibility. As Team Europe and Team NATO, we have shown significant unity and resolve over the past year. Looking ahead, these are key words we must take with us: courage, belief, accountability, and leave no room for fear. Thank you.
Thank you. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, please.
Yes, thank you, Prime Minister, Secretary General, dear Jens, dear Kaja. Thank you very much for hosting us in Tallinn on such a special day. Indeed, the day when 105 years ago, Estonia declared its independence. Estonia's determination to remain a free and independent country has been put to the test time and again. But independence was finally restored on the 20th of August 1991. And I also want to share a thought or quote of a famous Estonian, the former president, Lennart Meri, who said, "Europe is not geography. Europe is a unity of principles and an allegiance to principles. Principles shape geography. Geography does not shape principles." End of quote. And this is a truth that Putin has never understood. 1 year on, from the start of his brutal war, Putin has failed to achieve a single one of his strategic goals.
Is it that principles shape geography, or is it that, like, weather, and some man-made apparatus shape geography, but for the most part, natural things shape geography?
Instead of dividing the European Union, he finds us united and determined to stand by Ukraine for as long as it takes.
And China, the strategy of the turning point for peace to counter American hegemony, Beijing allied with Moscow in self-defense, the analysis. Beijing and Moscow share the same disenchanted vision of the international order defined by the West at the end of the Second World War. While the United States is chasing China practically everywhere, Mediation in the war in Ukraine would allow the Asian giant to present itself to the international community, especially to the global south, as a responsible player. And like it or not, in large part of the world, especially in Africa and Latin America, Chinese illiberal pragmatism retains enormous appeal. I'm going to disagree almost entirely with this article, but I'll read it to be critical. Solid as one rock, not even the unstable international situation will affect relations between China, Russia, the China-Russia word of Wang Yi, the special envoy appointed by Beijing to President, 12 points of the Chinese peace plan, first a bilateral with the homologue Sergei Lavrov, then the meeting at Kremlin by way of Vladimir Putin. After the visit of the head of Chinese diplomacy, friendship without limits between Beijing and Moscow, it's confirmed as granted. Of course, I guess this translation is not too accurate. Of course, the crisis was also discussed to Ukraine. The spokesperson of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Maria Zakharova, thanked the Chinese for their consistently balanced position on the matter. Their vision of the two countries on the current international issues largely coincide, he added. Yet behind the pleasantries, the latest warlike speeches by Putin, not to mention Moscow's withdrawal from the New START, certainly do not facilitate the desired mediation of Beijing. We've never talked about a peace plan, the Chinese ambassador to the UN specified on Tuesday, referring to the 12-point position paper released this morning. In the report, the leadership led by Xi Jinping, it simply reiterates the need for one-solution politics to the crisis, limiting itself to condemning the use of nuclear weapons. Again, the usual strategic ambiguity, not that Beijing wants to stay with its arms crossed, but from here to play the role of the peacemaker that passes. And the 12 points of the Chinese peace plan. Here's the complex text of the Beijing to end the war in Ukraine. To understand what they have in mind, Chinese need to reread the recent document on the Global Security Initiative by avoiding taking sides in the conflict. The text promotes the protection of sovereignty and the territorial integrity of all countries, respect for the purposes and principles of the Charter of the UN. It's a resolution of differences and controversies across the dialogue and the consultation. Nothing extraordinary. They're more or less the same concepts that have been guiding China's foreign policy since the era of Mao, but between the lines, the unpublished allusion to a possible appears new multilateral strategy. Literally, we speak of a high-level meeting. Just a few days ago, the Wall Street Journal associated the visit of Xi a Moscow scheduled for April-May with the intention of starting multi-party peace talks, a formula that, according to Zhang Jiang, professor of the prestigious Fudan University of Shanghai, could allude to the birth of a version Chinese of the Munich Security Conference. Here, the recent pacifist turn also reflects the personal ambitions of Beijing. Mediation in the war would allow the Chinese to present themselves to the international community. Above all, the Sud Global, as a responsible actor, able to protect interests of those countries that don't feel represented by the United States. It's no coincidence that apart from the UN, the ISG doesn't envisage the involvement of any Western organization, but of the Asian involving the countries of Southeast Asia, of the African Union, and of Arab League. Putin secretly decided to invade Ukraine. Lavrov, oligarchs, and Kremlin leaders kept in the dark. It's a new arm wrestling match between Washington and Beijing, consensus between economic models and competitive world views. Together we separate the multipolarismo and democratization in international relations, he said. Wang Yi meeting Lavrov will preserve the trend positive in the development of relations between great powers. This is the point. Beijing and Moscow share the same disenchanted vision of the international order defined by the West at the end of World War II. It's for self-defense, not to please Putin, that the Chinese media, they keep reviving Russian disinformation. Tuesday, Zhang Jun, he went further, officially calling for an investigation of him, or investigation on alleged American sabotage of the Nord Stream. Beijing's not forgotten the U.S. intelligence allegations about the laboratory Wuhan and supporting the propaganda of Moscow reciprocated the cheat. If the one in Ukraine is a proxy war, the political economic confrontation between Chinese and the United States is often referred to as a new Cold War. In proper terms, perhaps anachronistic, which however restore the idea of how the butterfly effect between the two sides of the Pacific increasingly have a global impact. While discussing a Pax Seneca between Moscow and Kiev just these days, China and Russia are engaged in joint military exercises off the coast of Durban in South Africa. Already in its second edition, the MOSI II operation is creating many problems for the government of listen to Cyril Ramaphosa, already beaten by the European chancelleries for abstaining in the UN vote last March. And I'll hold off on Transnistria for the next section. Watch this space.